David Lees is an expert in all matters French. More precisely, he's lecturer in French studies at the University of Warwick. David, pleasure to see you. Thanks as ever for joining us. We appreciate your time. Now, is the issue here that really there is a tale of two Petains?
I think absolutely, Mark. It's a tale of two Petains. The Petain of the First World War, in many ways, was kind of perceived as being courageous, heroic. This was a man who decided to rotate his frontline troops to try and protect as many people as possible, to try and avoid the kind of bloodshed that was seen elsewhere, and most notably, of course, elsewhere on the Somme. And he was perceived to be a kind of hero for many years, in particular, of course, in June 1940, when France decided, the French government was passed to Petain, and Petain decided to pursue an armistice, and the armistice which was met with huge relief by the French people. They were very happy to have Petain in charge. And indeed, Petain was near universally popular for most of the 4 years of his rule as head of the Vichy regime. So he was somebody who was very popular right the way through to the end of 1944. But he's also somebody whose legacy really relates primarily to the Second World War, and in particular, as you say, the second version of Petain, which was particularly with the complicity in the Holocaust. 76,000 Jews were deported during the 4 years of occupation and Vichy rule, and that remains his prime legacy.
It is a remarkable legacy indeed, as you say. And for Emmanuel Macron to say what he did about Petain being a great soldier and therefore maybe deserves to be celebrated, clearly, was it a question of the president kind of like speaking without thinking, which seems strange given he's the president, but presidents sometimes, obviously, their mouths run away with them?
I think it's very much a case of that, actually. I think in many ways, Macron may well rue the sort of missed opportunity to be a bit more nuanced here, to be a bit more explicit. This was a kind of throwaway phrase where he did acknowledge that, Petain made some terrible choices in the Second World War, but he didn't really have the opportunity or perhaps the thoughtfulness to try and talk more about Petain's role with the deportations in the Second World War, and to perhaps think more carefully before he actually said anything. And this, of course, comes in a context politically in France where Macron is trying his best to try and distract from domestic agendas around economic reform, trying to boost his own popularity. We're sort of midway through his presidency at this stage. So really, Macron has, he's got people to try and get back on board amongst the general electorate, and this really wasn't a very good opportunity to do so.
Now, there's the organisation called the CRIF, which represents French Jews, and of course they are extremely angry with what Macron had to say, so he's incurring their wrath. And is at the heart of this matter that France has this very difficult relationship with its Jewish population? It has the largest Jewish population in Europe, but clearly there have been issues over many, many generations about how those people are welcomed and part of French society.
Absolutely. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in France, which goes back to the medieval period. But in terms of more recent politics and history, particularly in the Second World War, most of the anti-Semitic legislation against Jews was targeted against foreign-born Jews, perceived to be not French, effectively people who were born beyond France. More recently, of course, what we've seen is a kind of shift towards blatant anti-Semitic actions or attacks, including many recent violent attacks, particularly in Paris. And so it's a long-term sense of essentially that France has failed to really come to terms with its role in the Holocaust, but also more recently has failed to have a kind of national narrative around the roles of Jewish people in French society. Now, France is not unique in this, of course. We know that the Labour Party in the UK has its own problems with anti-Semitism, or at least perceived anti-Semitism. But France really does have this major issue whereby it was one of the only Nazi-occupied Western European countries which actively was complicit in the Holocaust.
We talk about nuance, and obviously with Philippe Petain, Marshal Petain, this is an important word. But is it fair to say, David, that the treason and the roundups and what that led to in World War II completely erases the good that Petain did in World War I?
I think, in many ways, Petain is a kind of reverse Churchill. Churchill was perceived as being a failed military strategist in the First World War, Gallipoli being his most brutal and violent legacy. Whereas, Churchill was able to kind of rehabilitate his image with the Second World War and the way he was perceived to have led Britain in particular through to victory. Petain's the reverse. And you're absolutely right to say the main sort of legacy of Petain, and it will continue to be the case, both in terms of France and also elsewhere. Modern historiography, modern historians have suggested that this really is his legacy, is that complicity in the Holocaust. And as you say, the perceived treason, when Petain was tried after the war, in the immediate liberation period, he was tried for high treason, not for crimes against humanity. Arguably, had he lived longer, he would have been placed on trial for crimes against humanity with regards to the Holocaust. But that remains his legacy, and despite some kind of extreme right sympathisers wishing to kind of rehabilitate his image, Petain's real legacy in France today remains very much that case of a traitor and somebody who also deported of his own free will a number of Jews, a sizable number of Jews, 76,000 Jews, ultimately near to their deaths.
Absolutely shocking. David Lees from the University of Warwick, lecturer in French Studies. Thank you, sir, for your time, and thank you for your analysis. We really appreciate it.